a whisper in the dark beneath ancient stone, a relic untouched by time, and a lie so noble it was almost holy. In a city of art and shadows, one silent footstep echoed louder than any scream. This is not just a tale of murder, it's a descent into belief, illusion, and the price of preserving legends. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on an autumn morning, the sort that paints the pavements in sepia and muffles the streets in a hush of falling leaves, that I found Sherlock Holmes in one of his more listless moods. The Times lay unread on the hearthrug, his violin untouched by the window, and his long fingers drummed a slow rhythm against the arm of his chair. I had seen this manner before. It was the stillness of a hawk before the dive. Holmes was bored, and when Holmes was bored, it meant that some unfortunate soul somewhere was about to be very much less so. Our domestic quiet was broken by the doorbell, a single sharp note that seemed too urgent for the hour. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, bearing a card upon a silver tray. Holmes took it without looking up, then turned it over once before smiling faintly. "Show him in," he said. The man who entered was of middle age, impeccably dressed in a tailored grey coat and gloves of Moroccan leather, yet his eyes held a hunted gleam. "Monsieur Holmes, I beg your pardon for coming unannounced," he said with a slight accent. "My name is Armand Delacroix. I have travelled from Paris on a matter most grave and most secret." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite. "Then pray, monsieur, unburden yourself." Holmes studied our guest with the slow, penetrating gaze that had so often unnerved generals and criminals alike. "You arrived by the night steamer from Dieppe, changed in Calais, and did not sleep," he said. "Your right glove bears fresh ink along the thumb, indicative of haste or agitation, and the mud on your shoes is distinctively Parisian, from the Rue des Francs Bourgeois district." Delacroix blanched. "But how?" Holmes waved a hand. "Please, monsieur, if you wish to keep your secrets, I suggest you be quicker than your footprints." It was the first moment Delacroix truly looked frightened. "I am curator of antiquities at the Louvre," Delacroix said at last, lowering his voice. 3 days ago, a body was discovered within a sealed passage beneath the museum, a passage long thought inaccessible. I leaned forward. "A murder?" He nodded grimly. "A young assistant archivist, Émile Girard. He was found barefoot, with a Latin inscription scratched beside him in the dust. No signs of struggle, no stolen objects, and no explanation." Holmes interjected quietly. "You mentioned secrecy. Yes, the authorities do not yet know. The matter was confined to a select inner circle. To speak openly could invite scandal, perhaps more." "And why?" Holmes asked. "Have you come to me, rather than your own sûreté?" Delacroix hesitated. "Because I was instructed not to. The order came from above." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Orders not to involve the police, even in a matter of sudden death. Either your Louvre is staffed by fools, or by men protecting something more valuable than life." Delacroix flushed, but did not answer. Holmes pressed on. "Does this involve a relic, a theft, or perhaps a forgery too dangerous to admit?" Delacroix shifted uncomfortably. "I have said too much already, but if you agree to take the case, Monsieur Holmes, I will explain all." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Very well, but understand this. Truth, once uncovered, does not return to its grave." There was a pause, and then Holmes rose. "You have my confidence," he said, "and my curiosity." He turned toward the window where the morning fog had begun to lift. "I find, Watson," he murmured, "that cases which begin in shadows often end in fire. Let us see which this shall be." The account which followed was related in clipped tones, as though each word cost our visitor more in pride than breath. 3 days passed, said Delacroix. A chamber beneath the Denon wing, sealed since the time of the Second Empire, was accessed during a routine structural inspection. The corridor had been blocked by a fallen segment of masonry and, we believed, lost to time. He paused, glancing toward Holmes, as if measuring his readiness to believe. And yet, within it we discovered the body of a young man, Emile Girard, a junior assistant in our archival department. He was lying flat on his back, near a wall marked with a Latin phrase. He had no shoes, no evident wounds, and no sign of forced entry surrounded him. Holmes stirred, lacing his fingers. And how was this corridor rediscovered? Delacroix's eyes narrowed faintly. We were reviewing an old floor plan for reinforcement purposes. The wall concealed a narrow service arch that had been forgotten, until now. "Oh," Holmes said softly. "Forgotten by most." "What of the inscription?" Holmes asked, now fully alert. Delacroix nodded. It was etched into the dust beside the body, with a tool yet unidentified. The phrase read, "Non omnis moria." "Not all of me shall die," Holmes translated. A curious sentiment for a murder scene. Delacroix lowered his gaze. Indeed, no blood, no violence to speak of, yet there lay Girard, pale as a statue, the soles of his feet marked with what appeared to be chalk or plaster residue. The cause of death remains undetermined. Holmes tilted his head. The Latin quotation, poetic, philosophical, theatrical, not the language of chance. Had the boy any background in the classics? He was educated, Delacroix admitted, but not known for poetry. His work involved record restoration, quiet, methodical. Holmes tapped the edge of his armchair. And yet he ends his life, or rather has it ended, with a line fit for a tomb. He did not die alone, Holmes added. That, I think we may already conclude. There is another matter, Delacroix said hesitantly, as if reluctant to share. Near the boy's body, there was a reliquary. Holmes arched a brow. From one of the museum's collections. That is just it. It is not registered, not in any catalogue, and yet it bears the hallmark of Florentine work, early 16th century, and was housed in a glass cabinet, recently disturbed. Was anything taken from within? I asked. Nothing we can confirm. The cabinet was open, the velvet inside undisturbed. Yet we do not know what it once held. Holmes was quiet a moment. A missing relic, a murdered archivist, and a forgotten corridor. Yes, I see why you came. Delacroix's features were strained. Had it been known to the Directorate, it would already be in the papers, and the French press has little mercy. Most relics, Holmes said, are valued by their stories, not their contents. Remove the story, and what remains? Delacroix said nothing. There is perhaps, Delacroix said carefully, a section of the museum not all are privy to. Holmes leaned forward. Ah, now we find purchase. A small advisory circle, comprised of senior curators, some no longer living, who maintain the oldest records and collections, items not meant for public display, matters too politically delicate or historically dubious for the Louvre's reputation. An inner sanctum, Holmes remarked. Do you sit among them? I do not, Delacroix replied quickly, but I have been consulted on occasion. I know enough to recognize the markings on the reliquary's case as not belonging to any current inventory, and enough to know that others would wish this matter buried, if it is not already. And you brought it to me, Holmes murmured. Delacroix looked pained. Because something is deeply wrong. I knew the boy. He would never have taken his life. And if he found something, he may have died for it. Holmes' gaze remained fixed, his fingers still. It appears, Watson, we are not investigating a murder, but a silent. As Delacroix spoke, I observed Holmes' expression, watchful, analytic, yet tinged with an odd stillness. When our guest paused, Holmes said, "You say you knew the boy, yet you offered no eulogy, no remark upon his character." Delacroix shifted. "I respected him professionally. He was diligent." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "And you say nothing of his family or his habits, though you knew him well enough to risk scandal on his behalf. Curious." Delacroix hesitated. "I had mentored him briefly. He worked under my direction during archival reviews." Holmes gave the faintest smile. Not quite the full story, but enough to begin." There was a brief silence. Then Holmes added, "The ink upon your glove, was it from your own pen, or something you found among Girard's things?" Delacroix froze just for a second. "I retrieved some of his notes. They were unsorted. I intended to preserve them, or to ensure they did not fall into the wrong hands," Holmes said softly. Delacroix said nothing more. I had seen grief often enough during my medical years to recognize it in the curve of a shoulder or the tremble of a lip. Though Delacroix maintained a formal composure, I could not help but sense that his loyalty to young Girard was of a kind more private than professional. Holmes, for his part, allowed the silence to stretch. He studied the man's posture, the twitch of his right thumb, the faint line of ink along his sleeve. It struck me then how much Holmes could deduce from the residue of touch. A smear on linen, the slight stiffness of a cuff. At last, Holmes said, "There is always a cost to concealment, and the longer the secret is worn, the deeper the print it leaves." Delacroix did not meet his eyes. Holmes turned to me. "Pack lightly, Watson. I believe we are bound for Paris." And then, quietly to himself, "The Louvre is known for preserving truth in glass, but let us see what it hides behind stone." As Holmes rose, Delacroix spoke in a low, strained voice. "I do not ask for favour, only for silence. Until the truth is clear. France cannot afford a scandal." Holmes paused at the window. "Truth," he said, "has never been concerned with national reputations." Then, more gently, he added, "But I do not sell it cheaply, either." Delacroix nodded, and thus, with the echo of secrets still lingering in our study, we prepared to cross the Channel, into a past long buried beneath the halls of art. There was a peculiar clarity in Holmes' mood when engaged in international affairs. His long limbs seemed less restless aboard the steamer to Calais, and though he spoke little during the crossing, I noted his eyes frequently turned eastward toward France, as if tracking some invisible signal in the wind. "You may find it curious, Watson," he said as we neared the coast, "but I find museums rather like locked diaries. The trick lies not in reading what is displayed, but what has been deliberately left out." The air in Paris was a degree sharper than London's, and Holmes, relishing the contrast, made brisk work of our arrangements. "We begin," he said, "with stones and silence, and as always, footprints in the dust are better than whispers in a salon." By the time we passed under the ironwork of the Gare du Nord, Holmes had mapped the Louvre in his mind as neatly as I might diagram a wound on paper. Delacroix met us near the western facade of the Louvre and led us without ceremony through a side entrance far from the eyes of visitors. He passed several guarded thresholds before descending a narrow flight of stone steps, keys jangling like nervous percussion. The corridor in question lay beneath the Denon wing, a space more sepulchral than structural, a vaulted passage of dust-laden air. It was lined with disused piping and bricked recesses. The low-hanging lamps cast misshapen shadows across ancient stonework, and I confess to a feeling of unease as we proceeded. Holmes walked slowly, hands behind his back, eyes moving with feline precision. He paused near a segment of wall where the dust had been disturbed in an oval pattern, then crouched. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Where others see a footprint, I see a narrative. This man knelt here, twice, once, willingly, Once, unwillingly. How can you possibly know that? Holmes tapped the floor gently. Because this mark is clear. The other is smudged. The first left a question. The second, an answer. Holmes turned his attention upward, where the arched ceiling bore the soft imprint of time. A delicate black smear traced itself across the apex of the corridor, curling like the residue of an extinguished lantern. Curious, he muttered. Soot, but not the sort that lingers from ancient torches. This is recent and incomplete. He withdrew a handkerchief and dabbed gently at the surface. A faint powder came away. Camphor, he said. Someone burned it? I asked. Holmes nodded. As a preservative, or a disguise, it masks many scents, including blood and decay. But why burn it here? He stooped and tapped a dislodged stone near the base of the wall. And here, the mortar has been recently disturbed. Someone accessed this space through more than one entrance. You think they knew of the corridor in advance? I think, Holmes said, standing, that someone has been coming and going from this tomb of marble for some time, and the body merely interrupted their routine. He turned back to Delacroix. Who else knew of this passage? The curator hesitated. Very few. Fewer now. Delacroix guided us to a secluded office within the museum's archive wing, where we were introduced to Mademoiselle Madeleine Verviers, a woman of slight build, angular features, and a pair of eyes so sharp they seemed almost accusatory. I have heard of you, Monsieur Holmes, she said without ceremony. Though I must admit, I did not expect you to visit us over a corpse. Holmes offered a faint smile. The body is incidental. The silence surrounding it is what drew me here. Vervier's lips tightened. Then you must enjoy your stay in France, for silence is our oldest tradition. Holmes tilted his head. And you, mademoiselle? You specialize in the museum's lesser-known corridors? I specialize, she said coolly, in forgotten architecture and buried chambers. I do not study art. I study what it conceals. I watched as Holmes regarded her with mild interest. And yet, for all your knowledge, you did not suspect such a place existed. I suspected many things, she replied. But suspicion and proof are rarely friends in the Louvre. Holmes gave a quiet chuckle. Nor in life, mademoiselle. But they do dine together more often than people think. Our final interview of the day was with Claude Bisset, the Louvre's night watchman. A squat man with darting eyes and hands that moved too often for comfort. He answered questions with a studied vagueness and protested ignorance with a theatricality I found instantly suspicious. I see nothing, monsieur, he repeated, only statues and the darkness between them. Holmes was unimpressed. Yet you were assigned to the lower gallery 3 nights ago, the very night Girard is believed to have died. I am but one man. Indeed, Holmes replied, and yet your credit markers at the Café Mont Tabor suggest you have tried to live as 3. Bisset's mouth opened, then shut again. Holmes continued coolly. A man in debt often sees opportunity where others see danger, and silence, monsieur, is sometimes the cheapest currency of all. The watchman offered no rebuttal. Holmes merely turned away. Watson, he said as we left, I begin to suspect that the Louvre is guarded less by sentinels and more by shadows. Dr. Benoit Caron received us in a room that smelled faintly of varnish, age, and incense. A tall man with stooped shoulders and a clerical air, he greeted us with a thin smile and long-fingered hands that trembled ever so slightly. Tragedy, he said solemnly. The boy was gifted. Such promise, and now only prayers. Holmes inclined his head. You worked with the deceased? Caron nodded. He assisted in translating Latin manuscripts, nothing controversial. And yet he died in a corridor known only to a few. Caron made a pained expression. Curiosity may have led him astray. Holmes watched him closely. And what of the reliquary discovered near the body? Caron hesitated. It is unfamiliar to me. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at the man's ink-stained cuffs and added gently, "You've rehearsed this conversation, Dr. Karen. Not once, but several times. You fear discovery. That too is a kind of relic." Karen paled and turned away. Later that day, as we returned briefly to the subterranean corridor, Holmes paused near the southern wall and ran his gloved fingers lightly along a shallow groove in the stone. "Watson, would you be so good as to lend me your pocket lens?" I passed it to him, and he crouched with the intensity of a naturalist examining a rare beetle. "Interesting," he murmured. "A small flake of pigment, Veronese green, if I'm not mistaken." "Paint?" I asked. "Indeed. Not from the wall itself, but from something that once hung here, perhaps affixed or stored in secrecy." He scraped gently at the groove, then held up a second flake. "This one is layered, older beneath, newer above. A false restoration, perhaps." I looked around. "But there's no frame, no mount, nothing." "Which is exactly the point," Holmes replied. "Whatever hung here was taken before Girard's body was found, but not long before. The dust does not lie." He rose, brushing his coat. "This place is not merely a passage, it is a stage." At Holmes's suggestion, I paid a visit to the museum's archival department, an austere warren of narrow desks and aging ledgers. The clerk, a spectacled man named Lejeune, proved helpful enough once I mentioned Girard. He spent much of his time reviewing the 14th century acquisition registers, he told me. Odd material, monastic donations mostly, not of public interest. Did he request anything unusual? Lejeune frowned. Only once. A restricted volume. Registre de provenance, an index of items not included in the museum's official catalogue. And was he granted access? "By written permission," he said, "from Dr. Caron." I left shortly after, carrying a copy of Girard's request slip. The handwriting was firm, precise. Yet in the margins, faint and hastily scrawled, was one Latin phrase that chilled me. Non omnis moriar. I hurried back to Holmes with a heart that felt strangely heavier than before. When I rejoined Holmes that evening in the rooms provided to us, he was seated beside a table strewn with notes, museum pamphlets, and a single piece of white chalk. "Girard was no fool," he said without looking up. "He found something that contradicted the official record, and he was silenced for it." "The Latin quote," I offered. "He wrote it himself." "Perhaps. Or perhaps it was left by someone else. As a warning or a confession." I handed him the slip from the archive. He scanned it quickly, then smiled. "Note the handwriting in the margin. Hasty, emotional. The same hand that handled the archives also handled fear." He rose and began pacing. "Watson, we are dealing not with a thief, but with a scholar. One who rewrote history, perhaps quite literally. And the reliquary? Likely the centre of it all. A symbol of power or fraud. And if it was removed, it was not for profit, but for silence." I looked at him. "Then this case isn't about what was taken." Holmes turned, eyes gleaming. "No, Watson, it's about what was never meant to be found." It was in the quiet of our second evening in Paris, while seated by lamplight amid a mess of notebooks and reference tomes, that Holmes announced his latest discovery with maddening nonchalance. "Saint Denis," he said. I blinked. "The patron of Paris?" "Indeed. Beheaded, legend tells us, and still walked with his head in his hands. A fitting saint for a city so fond of intellectual contortions." I stared at him. "And what of him?" Holmes held up a museum catalogue dated some 30 years past, the pages yellowed and brittle. "This reliquary, the one found near Girard's body, was once part of a private display. It held, or was claimed to hold, a bone fragment of Saint Denis, a rib, to be precise. But no longer." Holmes shook his head. "Removed, quietly, and long enough ago that its amness has become institutional amnesia. I felt a chill then, not from the air, but from something more abstract. And if Girard rediscovered it? Holmes closed the book with a snap. Then he unearthed not a relic, Watson, but a lie so old it had begun to believe itself. The trouble with sacred objects, Holmes mused, is that they attract two kinds of men, those who worship them and those who would sell them. Over the next day, he traced a paper trail through the museum's internal memoranda with surgical precision. Aided by Delacroix's reluctant access, it began with a transfer ledger dated 1880, referencing a repositioning of select relics due to political unrest. But no subsequent re-entry appeared. The relic of Saint Denis had vanished, administratively, spiritually, and physically. Holmes tapped the margin of one document. Note the signature, Karen. At that time, he was merely assistant curator. You think he stole it? I asked. Holmes's expression was unreadable. I think he arranged for its disappearance. Whether he profited is another matter. But make no mistake, Watson, this was not mere clerical oversight. Someone took great pains to erase the trail. And Girard uncovered the gap and perhaps traced it too far. But why kill him? Holmes stood. Because sometimes a man does not fear exposure of a crime, but the collapse of the myth it supported. We returned to Girard's modest apartment, under the pretext of examining his notebooks once more. Holmes, however, had another goal in mind. He moved with silent purpose through the desk drawers, tapping beneath the base of one with his cane. A hollow thud confirmed his suspicion. With a quick twist, he lifted the false bottom to reveal a bundle of folded letters, tied with a green ribbon. He passed one to me. It was written in French, but even my passable reading could discern its tone. Intimate, anxious, affectionate. The signature, M. Madeline, I said. Holmes nodded. And not merely flirtation. Read the second paragraph. I did, and felt my brow crease. She speaks of the relic and says, if we are right, it changes everything. But if they suspect, you must not leave it in writing. Holmes smiled coldly. She had the instincts of a conspirator, but not the discretion, I said. These letters were hidden, yes, but not destroyed. That suggests two possibilities. Either he kept them as leverage, or as proof that someone would protect him. Holmes leafed through a final note. This one is curious. She writes, do not speak to Karen yet. He may suspect what I know, but not what I intend. He looked up. Now tell me, Watson, is that the language of love or of chess? In the quiet basement records room of the Louvre, we came upon a registry of former staff. Holmes pored over the names with unusual attention, then paused at a line dated October 1880. Jean-Baptiste Raguin, he read aloud. Senior curator, listed as resigned and departed for Morocco. And, Holmes looked up. He has no forwarding address, no pension withdrawals, no letters of recommendation filed. It's as if he resigned from existence. A brief inquiry at the prefecture confirmed Holmes's suspicions. No travel record existed for Raguin after 1880, nor any subsequent documentation. Delacroix, when confronted, looked pale. I remember him, he said. A man of strong opinions. He and Caron had disagreements about what belonged in the Louvre and what should be buried. And he simply left? Holmes asked. Delacroix hesitated. That was what we were told. Holmes nodded slowly. Then I believe the first disappearance did not occur this week, or this year, but 10 years ago, and the museum has been standing on a missing foundation ever since. It was then I realized we were not investigating a murder. We were exhuming a tomb, with no one willing to admit the grave existed. That evening, in our lodgings, Holmes had arranged Girard's papers in a precise spiral on the carpet. A strange map, I thought, but one he followed like a hound on scent. They wrote in cipher, he said, simple but clever. Each fourth word of their letters corresponds with passages from a rare volume of Apuleius, conveniently one housed here in Paris. With swift, surgical logic, he translated the fragments. One line read, Karen altered the records. Ragin saw it. Another, he fears exposure more than guilt. And finally, the reliquary is the key. It does not hold a relic, but a proof. Proof of what? I asked. Holmes tapped the last phrase. That the relic was never genuine. That it was fabricated to impress a foreign dignitary, perhaps as far back as Napoleon III. And Caron? Knew, perhaps even commissioned it. And when Girard uncovered the truth, Caron's entire career, his publications, his reputation, stood to collapse. Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. But what interests me most is this line from Madeleine. If we fail, he will not stop at ruin. He cannot afford to. I swallowed. Then she knew what was coming? She knew, Holmes said grimly, and I believe, Watson, she used it. The question now is, for what? I had known Holmes long enough to recognize when he withheld more than he said. And that night, as we sat by the fire in our modest Paris lodgings, the silence between us was not born of comfort, but of calculation. There is a shape to this matter now, he murmured, staring into the flames. A geometry of guilt. And what form does it take? I asked, though I half expected to be brushed aside. He folded his hands beneath his chin. It takes the form of a reliquary, Watson, not because of what it held, but because of what it never did. He rose suddenly and began pacing. Girard uncovered a fraud so delicately sustained that its exposure would unravel more than reputations. It would corrode the foundation of those who believe they are guardians of truth. You believe Caron is our man? I believe he is the keystone, yes, but not the architect. No. There is still a final movement left in this fugue. I leaned forward. Then what do you intend? Holmes's eyes sparkled. We must recreate the silence that Girard walked into. The same hour, the same corridor, the same conditions. If a conscience stirs or a threat remains, it will come to meet us. And me? I asked. You, my dear Watson, he said with an all too pleasant smile, shall be positioned not unlike an archivist, present, unnoticed, and most dangerously of all, listening. I confess I found little peace in the hours that followed. Holmes, for his part, remained composed, methodical in his preparations, as if arranging a scientific experiment rather than laying a snare for a murderer. You're walking into the lion's den, I muttered as he adjusted his collar. Hardly, he replied. I merely proposed to rattle the skeletons. The plan, such as it was, hinged upon Holmes taking Girard's place within the subterranean corridor at the precise hour the young man had last been seen alive. Delacroix, under Holmes's instruction, had discreetly secured the necessary access. The corridor would be left open, the reliquary returned to its display case, and Holmes seated in darkness, as still as memory. What if the killer does not come? I asked. Then we wait, Holmes said simply. But guilt is like a wound, Watson. It festers. And those who conceal it often seek to tend it, to visit it in solitude. That is when we strike. Not with force, but with presence. I took my place in a narrow alcove some 10 yards distant, my revolver in one hand and my breath held in the other. Time passed slowly in that tomb of stone. Footsteps above, then silence, then a whisper of something far more unsettling, movement from within the dark. And though I could not see Holmes, I knew at once the trap had begun to close. Though I had grown accustomed to Holmes placing me in various degrees of peril or concealment, I admit to some unease as he instructed me in low tones that evening. You will wait here, Watson, he said, indicating a recess in the stonework just beyond the chamber containing the reliquary. You are not to move unless I call out. And if you do not call out, then you are to wait longer. I gave a wry smile. Ever the gentleman, Holmes, dressed as one of the museum's lower workmen, had darkened his face slightly and donned a threadbare coat. His resemblance to the porters we had passed earlier was uncanny. I have no doubt our visitor will expect solitude, he said. What he will not expect is to find a mind in the darkness sharper than his own. And if more than one comes, then, my dear fellow, he said with a hint of amusement, let us hope you brought the pistol I so gently encouraged you to carry. With that, he vanished into the gloom beyond the reliquary, his movements utterly silent. I took my position and steadied my breath. The hour had not yet struck, but the silence felt thick enough to break with a whisper. Midnight arrived, not with a bell, but with a breath of cold air through the corridor. A subtle shift that made the hair along my arms rise beneath my coat. Then, a faint click. It was not the sound of a door or footfall, but something mechanical, long dormant and grudging in its awakening. A low grinding issued from the southern wall. I peered through the narrow slit in my alcove and saw a section of stone shift backward, then slide away on hidden runners. From the gap emerged a figure cloaked in black and carrying a lantern muffled in cloth. He moved with the caution of a man who feared not discovery but recognition. Every gesture was careful, every footfall was deliberate. He crossed to the reliquary with practiced ease, pausing before it like a priest before an altar. His hands moved with certainty, examining the hinges, feeling the velvet interior, running fingers along the glass. I heard a soft intake of breath behind me. Holmes had risen from his concealment. "Good evening, Dr. Caron," he said quietly. The figure froze. "For a man so committed to sanctity, you make a poor ghost." The lantern flared suddenly, fully uncovered, and illuminated the pale and ashen face of Dr. Benoit Caron. He looked not startled, but defeated, as though he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and found no alternate ending. Holmes took a step closer. "Let us speak, monsieur, before your silence becomes permanent." Caron's lips parted, but no words came at first. Holmes regarded him not with triumph, but with a cool, academic detachment, as one might study a rare fossil now stripped of its mystery. "You knew this passage existed," Holmes said, "because you used it once before, 10 years ago." Caron's face twitched. "You have no proof." Holmes raised a hand. "No? Then let us examine what I do have. A forged catalogue entry, a missing relic, a curator who vanished without record, and a reliquary that bears the faintest scent of camphor, the very compound you used to mask the degradation of the so-called relic of Saint Denis." Caron's mouth tightened. "I did not kill him. You had motive, you had means, and you had a history of removing obstacles." For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the museum above. Then Caron whispered, "He would have destroyed everything, my work, my name, France's honour." Holmes tilted his head. "So you became his confessor and his executioner?" "I asked him not to publish. I begged him." Caron's voice cracked. "He would not listen, so I arranged the rest." Holmes stepped closer. "And the relic?" Caron looked away. "Gone, years ago. Sold to an American collector under another name. I replaced it to preserve the illusion." "To preserve yourself," Holmes corrected coldly. There was a long silence. Then Holmes said, "You are not the only one who played a part in this." At that, Caron's head jerked up, shocked not by accusation, but by the implication of someone else. Holmes had struck a nerve. "I did it to protect France," Caron said, with a sudden, almost pitiful fervour. The relic was to be displayed before the Prussian ambassador in 1870. We were desperate to project continuity, sanctity, strength. Holmes folded his arms. And you created a fiction. It was more than fiction. It was necessity. The war, the revolution, we were losing everything. The church approved it. The government looked away. And Girard? Holmes asked quietly. Karen looked down. He was brilliant, too brilliant. He found the ledger. He asked questions. I tried to delay him, to warn him. But when he told Madeleine, I knew it would spread. He closed his eyes. So I waited until his work shift ended, and I called him down here, under the pretense of examining a transfer record. You drugged him? No. I confronted him, pleaded. He refused. He said he would expose it, so I pushed him. Holmes did not move. Pushed him? Karen opened his eyes. He fell backwards, hit his head on the stone. It wasn't supposed to be. Ah, Holmes interrupted. But that is the nature of silence. It always becomes louder once blood is spilled. Karen began to shake. You must understand, monsieur, it was not for me. It was for something greater than any of us. Holmes looked to me briefly, then said, if only relics could absolve the living as easily as they absolve the dead. But Holmes was not to have the final word. From the corridor's far end came the echo of a heel upon stone, sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably feminine. Madeleine Verviers stepped into the lamplight, her expression unreadable. Her gloved hands were clasped before her, and her gaze moved from Karen to Holmes, and then to the reliquary, as if taking inventory of a narrative long in the making. So, she said with quiet finality, you finally said it. Karen's face contorted. Madeleine, you shouldn't be here. I've always been here, she replied, in the margins, in the silences, watching men make history out of fiction. Holmes narrowed his eyes. You knew. Of course I knew, she said, stepping forward. I read the ledger before Emile ever did. I led him to it. I stared at her. Then you. I didn't kill him, she said. But I used him. His earnestness, his trust. I wanted Karen to confess, and he did. But to the wrong man. Karen's voice broke. You manipulated us both. Madeleine's eyes gleamed. You manipulated truth. I merely rearranged the consequence. Holmes's voice cut through the tension like steel. And what consequence do you believe you deserve? She smiled faintly. I'll let the law decide that. Holmes nodded to me. Watson, I raised the whistle Holmes had given me earlier and blew once, sharp and high. Above, footsteps thundered. Below, the past exhaled. The arrival of the gendarmes above did little to disturb the stillness between the three of us. Madeleine stood without fear, Karen frozen in shame, and Holmes, his expression calm and unreadable, watched as the final threads of deception unwound. I did not kill Emile, she said again, as though speaking it louder might place her firmly on the side of innocence. But I knew of the forgery. I knew of Karen's relic and of the truth Girard had stumbled upon. Karen turned to her, wounded. Why did you not stop him? She did not flinch. Because I needed him to draw the arrow, and when it struck, I wanted the target to bleed. You used me, Karen whispered. I used both of you, she replied, without a flicker of guilt. Emile was a boy who believed in truth. You were a man who feared it. I only helped them meet. I stepped forward. Then all this, his death, your silence. It was orchestrated. She tilted her head. Not orchestrated. Encouraged. I did not tell Karen what Emile had found until I was certain he would panic. I knew what panic does to men like him. Holmes finally spoke. And what does it do to women like you, mademoiselle? She met his gaze squarely. It makes us careful. Holmes turned slightly toward me. Watson, I believe the Louvre has been a cathedral built on omissions. And tonight, its candles are flickering low. From above, a door slammed open. Shadows moved fast upon the stair. Perhaps it was the sound of approaching boots, or perhaps it was the unbearable press of truth laid bare. But something in Karen snapped. With a sudden guttural sound, more beast than man, he lunged toward the reliquary. Whether he meant to shatter it or seize some final proof, I could not tell. What I do recall is the sound of glass breaking and Madeline's cry of surprise as she stumbled backward. Holmes moved quickly, catching Karen's arm, but the older man twisted free with the strength of desperation. A bronze lamp was raised. He meant to strike. I did not think, only acted. The report of my revolver echoed like judgment. The bullet struck the wall above Karen's shoulder, a deliberate miss, but enough to make him freeze. Enough, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. This has gone far enough. Karen dropped the lamp. It rolled across the stone with a hollow clang. He slumped beside the reliquary, weeping quietly. Madeline knelt, not beside him, but beside the broken case. From it she lifted a scrap of cloth, aged velvet, and nothing else. "It's empty," she whispered. "No," Holmes said from the shadows. "It holds something still." She looked at him, puzzled. "Consequence," he replied. Then he stepped forward, gesturing toward the stairwell. "Watson, if you please." As we emerged into the cool air of the museum courtyard, the officials took charge of Karen and Madeleine. Delacroix stood by the carriage, pale and silent. I turned to Holmes. "You suspected her all along?" He nodded. "From the moment she described herself as a student of what art conceals. Her words were too knowing, and her study too carefully arranged. You searched it, discreetly. I found a second reliquary beneath the false floorboards, a near-perfect replica of the one Girard discovered. It was empty, save for a note addressed to herself. He handed it to me. The paper was aged, the writing delicate. In fiction, I found the truth men refused to write, so I wrote it in relics instead." "She recreated the deception," I murmured. "To study it? To control it," Holmes replied. "She was no killer, but she was no bystander either. And the original relic? Gone, likely forever, but its ghost remains, as do the stories wrapped around it." I watched the figures vanish into the waiting carriages, each bearing their own shadows. Holmes lit a cigarette. "You see, Watson, the Louvre is filled not with truth, but with agreement. Tonight, we broke the frame around one lie." He exhaled. "And I suspect there are many more waiting in the walls." We returned to our lodging just as the city's gas lamps flickered to life, their yellow halos stretching like faded memories across the wet stones of the Rue de l'Université. Holmes had been unusually silent throughout our journey back from the Louvre, his gaze fixed not upon the passing world but rather somewhere inward, as though assembling the final pieces of a private mosaic. I confess I had grown restive. The events of the night had unfolded with such velocity that my mind lagged behind, filled with unanswered questions, half-explained turns, and that peculiar gnawing sense that Holmes had, once again, glimpsed the full architecture of the affair long before I had found the first stair. "Holmes," I said at last, when the tea had been poured and the fire coaxed to life, "you owe me a tale." He raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" "Come now," I said, sinking into the armchair opposite him. "You laid your trap, sprung it, and swept us all into the net without so much as a proper prologue. You might have at least let me reload my revolver." Holmes gave a faint smile and reached for his pipe. "Very well, Watson. Since the theatre has closed and the actors now sleep in separate cells, let us discuss the playwright behind the curtain and the pages you did not see." "It begins," Holmes said, "not with a murder, but with ambition. Dr. Karen, for all his scholarship and velvet restraint, arrived at the Louvre 21 years ago under less than stellar circumstances. He was not the first choice for his post, nor even the second. His appointment came during a period of internal scandal, one which, naturally, the museum kept hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic gloss. I nodded. Yes, Madeline hinted at a past curatorial lapse. Indeed, a major acquisition turned out to be spurious. The museum's prestige trembled. Karen was brought in as a stabilizing figure, but he lacked academic weight and institutional allies, so he manufactured his own. You mean the relic? Holmes tapped the rim of his pipe. Precisely, a medieval reliquary. Subtly dazzling, never ostentatious, was just the thing to polish the Louvre's reputation. Caron created it, or rather, orchestrated its emergence. A rediscovered artifact linked to a minor saint, plausible in legend and secure in detail, enough to invite pilgrimage, admiration, and confidence. And no one suspected. No one wanted to. It fit the narrative the institution desired. Even the church, content to be remembered in gold and glass, asked no awkward questions. Karen's star rose. He published lectures, secured endowments. Eventually he became a pillar. I frowned, but it was all a lie. Ah, Watson, most relics are, Holmes said coolly. But this one became dangerous not because it was false, but because someone remembered it should not exist at all. Émile Girard, Holmes continued, was by all accounts an able young man with an unfortunate virtue. He believed that truth was valuable in and of itself. I leaned forward. He found evidence. More than that, he had been assisting with the digitization of cloister inventories from Burgundy. Dry work, but occasionally revelatory. Among them, he discovered a 14th century record listing relics transferred during a cathedral fire. One such reliquary matched the one Karen had introduced years later, except, according to the inventory, it had been destroyed in 1748. So the Louvre's relic could not be the original. Precisely. Girard was intrigued. He compared engravings, noted differences in age marks, alloy inconsistencies, little things Karen had missed or presumed no one would check. By early spring, the boy had assembled a dossier worthy of demolition, and instead of reporting it officially, he went to Madeline. Holmes nodded. A mistake not of intellect, but of misplaced admiration. Girard viewed her as a reformer, sharp, principled, modern. What he did not realize was that she viewed the Louvre as a stage, and herself as its eventual conductor. My hands clenched around the teacup. She saw an opportunity. She did. Rather than suppress the discovery, she encouraged Girard to keep investigating, but subtly steered him toward Caron, aware of the pressure it would create. She watched them move, let tension ferment. And when Caron found out, he panicked. Yes, the panic of a man who has built his name atop a fiction. He confronted Girard, and in that moment, whether by rage, fear, or sheer collapse, he committed murder. The relic was not the only thing lost that night. Holmes stirred the ash in his pipe thoughtfully. Do you recall, he said, when Delacroix remarked that Madeleine Verviers never sought fame, but somehow always found herself at the centre of attention? Yes, I replied, and I thought it rather an odd compliment. It was not a compliment, Holmes said. It was a warning. He stood and began pacing slowly. Madeleine Verviers was not content with scholarship. She sought control, of narrative, of reputation, of position. Girard's discovery was a lever, and Caron a fulcrum. You believe she anticipated his reaction? Holmes turned. I believe she counted on it. Whether she expected murder is uncertain, but she knew Caron would not risk exposure. Her letters to him, which I later examined, are carefully phrased. Urgent, persuasive, but never explicit. She offered him silence in exchange for mentorship, and perhaps more, I said quietly. Indeed, their correspondence hints at affection, though likely one-sided. Karen, guilt-ridden and increasingly erratic, drew closer to her. She, in turn, allowed him to believe she would shield him. But instead she used him. Like a marionette, Watson, she orchestrated press interviews, arranged closed-door consultations, and positioned herself as the only stable mind amid Karen's deterioration. The museum board, already nervous, had begun whispering about succession. "And then you arrived." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes," at which point she realized her story had too many authors. I paused. "There is one thing I still do not understand, Holmes." "Only one?" "I'm slipping." I chuckled despite myself. "The reliquary itself. You said it was a forgery. Yet when Delacroix opened the case in your presence, it appeared untouched." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Appearances are the Louvre's true masterpieces." He crossed to his desk and withdrew a folded paper. A rubbing from the reliquary stand, taken the day after Girard's death. "Observe," he said, 3 parallel scratches, shallow and recent, made, I believe, by an iron tool scraping hastily against the base. A crowbar? Or a small chisel? You see, someone attempted to remove the reliquary and then changed their mind. Why? Because they were interrupted, likely by Delacroix's unexpected inspection. I surmise Madeleine planned to replace the original forgery with a duplicate of her own design, one which would align with her version of the truth. A relic cleansed of scandal, but still suitable for display. I frowned. But wouldn't that create more questions? Only if one looked too closely. Most would not. She had planned to arrange the narrative. Karen collapses. She steps in, the relic is quietly retired, and no one is the wiser. But she moved too late. My arrival accelerated the decay. I shook my head. A relic, a murder, a forgery of a forgery, and a woman who nearly rewrote history with a scalpel instead of a sword. Holmes exhaled. "Yes, Watson. In the end, it was not faith that preserved the relic, nor truth that destroyed it. Merely human ambition, wrapped in velvet and dust." "Still," I ventured, for all the elegance of her scheme, what ultimately condemned Madeleine? The relic, you say, was about to be replaced, but that alone would not have sufficed as evidence. Holmes inclined his head. "Quite right, Watson. Were we reliant solely upon the scratches on a reliquary stand and the emotional instabilities of 2 compromised scholars, I dare say the case would have dissolved into ambiguity. But Miss Verviers, for all her intellectual prowess, made 2 errors, and I caught them both." I gestured for him to continue. "The first was linguistic," he said. "You may recall the cipher Girard had scrawled, tucked into the margin of his edition of Bouchard's medieval register. The quotation about the silence that kills the saint. Precisely. It was not merely symbolic. The cipher was composed in a variant of Provençal script, one no longer taught in university circles. Girard had no exposure to such texts, but Madeleine had recently translated a similar codex for the Sorbonne archives. Her annotations, stored in the faculty's folio room, bore the same idiosyncratic hand. And the second error, she knew the exact location of the reliquary before it was moved, knowledge supposedly kept between Caron and Delacroix alone. When I asked her, during a seemingly innocuous discussion, to describe the vault layout, she corrected me on the placement of a column visible only from the interior corner. Holmes rose and stretched. The cipher damned her intellect, the column damned her memory, and both, Watson, sealed her fate. The hour had grown late, and the soft hush of Parisian rain outside our window lent Holmes's final words a curious stillness. He stood at the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, and stared into the coals with an expression I had seen only a few times before, neither triumph nor detachment, but something closer to weariness. "Do you know, Watson," he said quietly, "I have often wondered which is the greater lie, the criminal's fiction or society's." I frowned. You mean the Louvre? Indeed. This place, so venerated in guidebooks and sermonized by scholars, is a cathedral of selective memory. For every statue it polishes, there is a ruin it ignores. For every relic it displays, there is another it buries. Dr. Karen forged one artifact, but the institution has forged centuries of sanctity. You sound almost cynical. Not cynical, my dear fellow, merely observant. Institutions, like men, craft narratives not to reflect truth, but to survive. Caron's crime was not unique. He merely aped what the museum itself had long practiced, shaping perception for the sake of legacy. I pondered this in silence. And Madeleine? She understood the theatre, Holmes said. She simply wished to direct it. That is her tragedy, and her downfall. A woman of brilliance, undone by ambition, indistinguishable from the very forces she sought to replace. He returned to his chair, lit his pipe again, and added in a softer voice, "In the end, Watson, this case was not about saints, nor scholars, nor relics. It was about the masks that even the most sacred institutions wear, and what happens when someone tries to change the mask without altering the face beneath it." We sat for a time in companionable silence, the glow of the fire flickering across the rain-streaked glass. Outside, the Louvre slumbered behind stone and illusion, and inside, the truth, restless and unburied, remained where Holmes always found it, in the smallest crack, the faintest smudge, the whisper that history tried to hush. It was 2 days after our return to Baker Street when Holmes finally spoke of Paris. The November fog lay thick against the windows, and my medical journal sat unopened on my lap. Holmes, stretched languidly in his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, had puffed his pipe in silence for the better part of an hour. "At times, Watson," he said at last, "I find myself more intrigued by the architecture of deception than by the criminal act it conceals." "You mean Caron?" "Among others. There were more masks in that museum than even the curators catalogued." I said nothing. There was something haunting about that marble silence, those empty galleries that had once echoed with Gerard's doomed footsteps. Holmes glanced at me. "We solve puzzles, my friend, but rarely do we mend the walls they hide behind." And with that, he returned to his pipe, and I to my thoughts. As I considered the affair in retrospect, it struck me how strangely bloodless the crime had felt. Not in the literal sense, of course, for poor Gerard had perished, but in its motive, in its temperament. There had been no fortune to be won, no inheritance disputed, no clandestine affair exposed. It was a crime of intellect, born of the silent war between truth and preservation. "Murder, Holmes," I said, "is often born of passion or profit. But this, it was almost philosophical." "Ah," he replied, eyes half-lidded. "A duel fought not with pistols at dawn, but footnotes at dusk." I wonder, I mused aloud, how many lives have been altered by the quiet machinery of scholarship? Those who read too deeply into legends, others prefer to leave undisturbed. Holmes merely nodded. "The deadliest truths, Watson, are those that cast shadows on sacred stones." Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe and leaned forward, his gaze keen beneath the soft gaslight. "Let us suppose," he began, "that one were to fabricate a relic, not for personal gain, but to restore faith, to preserve the illusion of continuity in a world increasingly disillusioned. Is the lie any less perilous?" I shrugged. "It would seem less malicious." "And yet," Holmes countered, "perhaps more so. For when a man deceives for profit, we may predict his aims. But when he lies in the name of virtue, his path grows unpredictable, and others are swept into his delusion." I watched him closely. "You believe Karen was sincere?" "Utterly. That is what made him dangerous. Madeline saw the fissure in his conviction and pushed, but it was his sacred lie that opened the door. He exhaled a slow plume of smoke. Men speak of saints and miracles, Watson, but they rarely ask who built the altar beneath them, or whether the stone remembers the truth. Even now, when I think of the Louvre, it is not the grand staircase nor the gilded frames that return to me, but the hush beneath, that cold stone corridor where Girard's final breaths echoed, where the reliquary stand bore scratches like claw marks on conscience. In quieter hours, I find myself wondering whether our footfalls are still heard there, ours and his and Madeleine's, whether the stone remembers more than it tells. Paris has returned to its rhythms. The curators smile, the guides recite, but deep beneath that edifice of reverence, I fancy the truth still walks, silent, careful, and uninvited. The fire had dwindled to embers when Holmes, without looking up from the Times, offered his final remark. "It's curious," he said, "how often men kill not for what is, but for what they believe ought to be." "You mean Madeline? She pursued the relic's seat, not for its contents, but its meaning. And Karen clung to a fraud to safeguard faith. Between them, a man died." He folded the paper with a crisp snap. "Gold inspires theft, Watson. Genius invites envy. But sacredness, that inspires silence, loyalty, and murder." And as he rose to toss the last of the ash into the grate, I realized that in Holmes' world, even a saint's bone could rot, but illusion, well maintained, might live forever. As the lamplight flickered gently across the familiar interior of Baker Street, Holmes remained in his chair, fingertips pressed together, gaze distant. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "some crimes are not born of greed, nor of passion, but of preservation. Of an idea so revered, its falsehood must be protected like sacred flame." I nodded, though uneasily, and in this case, the relic itself meant less than the illusion it upheld. Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "Precisely. It is the illusion that men will kill for. Gold tarnishes. Faith, that is far more durable and far more dangerous." What do you think? Was the true motive here ambition, belief, or something more tragic? And at what point did preserving a legacy become more important than telling the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read your theories. And if you enjoy unraveling the shadows with Holmes and me, don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries like this one. Perhaps someone you know would enjoy the chase. Do share the story with them.